Hello everyone, welcome back to topic 2 of this week in both American History 2 and World Civilizations 2. Today, obviously, as you can see, we're going to discuss the conclusion of World War II and some of the more unfortunately horrible things that went on as a result of this war, which I'm sure most of you are already at least somewhat familiar with. Now, of course, we're going to focus on some key terms at first. One thing I do want to spend a bit of time on today is looking at some of the more impressive World War II technology. We're naturally going to look at something called Project Manhattan. We're going to look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We'll, of course, look at the Holocaust. And we're going to conclude looking at the somewhat lesser-known Japanese internment camps. Again, just a very quick summary of your upcoming dates. Midterm is coming up on the 23rd. The debate will be sometime during the week of October the 30th, which, as I mentioned in my last video, by the time you view this, the time should have been announced and you should be able to start signing up for teams. Your final essay bibliography will also be due on November the 6th at 5 p.m. I already talked about these a little bit in the last video, so I won't spend much time on them here, but do please be aware that these are here and let me know if you have any questions as soon as possible. Especially for the rest of the semester, because I have quite a bit of other things to do. I'm not going to be able to be very helpful if you come to me about an assignment problem very close before the assignment due date, and really I can't be helpful at all anymore after the due date. At this point, I'm giving you enough advance notice. Let me know about problems as soon as you can. Otherwise, there's not much I can do. But anyway, to jump right into the thick of things, again, as you go out throughout this semester, and especially throughout this World War II analysis, again, please be prepared to explain the two major events that turned the war against Nazi Germany, how they were similar to World War I, and what these reveal about a weakness in Hitler's strategy. What was one of his main military problems as a military strategist? I'll get so good at talking eventually. Now, like I said, we're going to look a little bit at some of the technological advances of World War II this time. First, let's take a look at radio communication. Radio communication was particularly useful for the German Blitzkrieg early in the war. Why would this radio communication be so helpful for a lightning war strategy, do you think? Alright, very good. For those of you who remember what we talked about with the Blitzkrieg last time. Radio communication is, of course, very crucial if you're going to have a very fast-moving army, especially when a lot of it is made up of mechanized weaponry. In order to quickly overwhelm an enemy and to coordinate these quickly moving attacks, you have to have some form of communication that's more instantaneous than just trying to shout over the sound of a tank being fired, obviously. So quick communication is very crucial for quick attacks, otherwise you just have to sit in the trench and wait for an order to get to you manually. Improved aircraft was also particularly useful in the Pacific theater of the war, which we'll talk a bit about today. For example, aircraft had improved to the point that aircraft carriers could now launch planes directly from the sea, so fleets didn't even have to meet in person or visually in order to fight. This was especially common throughout the Australia campaign of 1942, which we'll talk a little bit about today. Radar technology was also incredibly useful, especially for the Allies. Radar technology allowed you to detect incoming bombers, could help ships navigate in bad weather, could also help you navigate around enemy mines, and could be placed on ships, on aircraft, or even just on the ground like you can see here. So again, these are considered to be some of the most important technological innovations of the war, and radar technology is particularly crucial for allowing the British to win the invasion of London when the Germans tried to overwhelm the British with their air superiority. Again, these technologies were very crucial in various turning points of the war. Now, I also want to spend a bit of time talking about the role of American women in World War II. This is especially relevant for my American History 2 class, but I also don't think it hurts to get a bit more of an American perspective for my World Civilizations 2 class. World War II was especially important for women during this time because it gave them the opportunity to break out of traditional female employment roles. Now, this is not in any way to diminish the role of women in the war, but it is somewhat an oversimplification to say that this was the first time in American history women got into the workforce. Those of you who especially have been in my World Civilizations 2 class, where we talked about the Industrial Revolution, You'll remember that we talked about how women and children were getting involved in the workforce during the Industrial Revolution. The crucial part is that women were being able to break out of traditional female employment roles. Now, this maybe seems simple, but why is that going to be the case? Awkward pause once again. But yes, very good. Of course, the issue here is that the men, for the most part, are going off to war. This is one of the largest deployments in American history that we had ever seen. So thousands upon thousands and millions of men had left the country to go overseas. So now women are having to pick up the slack and keep the industry rolling. Because you, of course, can't fight a war no matter how many people you have if you don't have supplies. So this allowed women to break out of typical female roles, like being stuck as a secretary, maybe a nurse at best, school teacher, things like that, and get involved in more quote-unquote masculine roles, like producing, or like engineering and some sort of manufacturing. It is estimated that about 5 million women entered the workforce between 1940 and 1945. They would get involved in working for defense plants, factories, and especially the aircraft industry, while also replacing men in office jobs and other non-war industries. So it wasn't just war industries, because of course men from all walks of life had gone in to fight in the war as well. This of course led to the famous propaganda campaign regarding Rosie the Riveter, which was actually launched in May 29th of 1943 on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. Now, what do you think the purpose of Rosie the Riveter was, and why was she necessary? Yeah, I'll give you a short pause on that one because I basically already gave it away. Of course, the purpose of this is to convince women to engage in their patriotic duty to help support the war effort, which of course is necessary because even though these jobs have been abandoned by the men, you of course still have to have people working in the factories because once again, you can't win a war without the supplies and the weapons necessary to fight it. Just to give you an idea of how successful this Rosie the Riveter campaign was and how productive American manufacturing was, during the course of the war, the Americans produced a humongous output of weapons and materials. For example, 300,000 aircraft were produced, 88,000 other types of aircraft were produced, sorry, that's a typo, 215 submarines were produced, 147 aircraft carriers were produced, 952 warships were produced, 86,333 tanks were produced, 531 million tons of bombs were produced, and 12,573,000 rifles and carbines were produced. So again, enormous production output, this was essentially the greatest industrial output the world had ever seen at this point. Which, by the way, I haven't really had a chance to talk about it earlier, but this is especially relevant to my American History 2 class. It is the New Deal, while it did help alleviate some of the problems of the Great Depression, this production output is actually considered to be what helped get America out of the Great Depression. The government invested so much time and regulation into this war industry that it helped get it off the ground, and the need was so great that all this production was able to, of course, net a huge profit that helped get enough people in the workforce that we were eventually able to finally recover from the Great Depression. So yeah, for those of you, for example, who are fans of the comedian Bo Burnham, when he makes the joke, "What is war? Good God, y'all, what is it good for?" And he says, "Increasing domestic manufacturing." That's actually not just a joke. That actually is true. It is the domestic manufacturing of World War II that helped get us out of the Great Depression. Sorry, by the way, that I didn't sing it. I thought I'd keep a little bit of dignity to save myself. But anyway, to get you a little bit into the conclusion of the war, to quickly go through the conclusion in the European theater. By October of 1942, once America had joined the war, the Allied commanders got together and decided to open up a new front to take a heat off of the Soviets. Because what a lot of people don't actually know is that the Soviet Union was essentially bearing the brunt of most of the war against Germany. As I mentioned, they were facing the largest military invasion the world had ever seen. For example, when I was in undergrad at Western, we had a Soviet Union historian come into our class one day in my European military history class, and he told us that in comparison to about 15 divisions of the German army fighting us in the West against the Great Britain, United States, and the French resistance, the Soviet Union were facing about 30 to 50-something divisions of the German army. So actually, the vast majority of the German army was focused on this invasion to the east, We were essentially just opening up a front on the west to take some of the heat off of the Soviet Union. I think that is a bit important to focus on because it could help change some of our opinions about the Soviets' role in the war. In most American history classes, we don't typically talk about the Soviet invasion and what the Soviets went through during the war, but it is arguable that they were even more crucial than America's entry in helping to bring about the defeat of Nazi Germany. This opening of a new front was successful, and by February of 1945, the Allies had essentially knocked back all of the German and Italian gains during the war. For example, in May of 1943, they liberated North Africa. The city of Rome, and most of Italy had been liberated by June of 1944. Paris, France, and most of Western Europe was liberated by August of 1944, starting, of course, with the infamous D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, which took place roughly in this zone right here off of the English Channel. And by March of 1945, the Allied powers had broken across the Rhine River and had officially entered Germany, while, of course, the Soviet Union was doing the exact same thing over from the east. Now, to give you a bit more of a realistic idea and to bring home the realities of this war, what I'd like for you to do now is to view this video here, which is the opening scene to the famous movie Saving Private Ryan, which pretty accurately depicts the characteristics of the D-Day landing. Now, one thing I do want to be aware of, especially if this kind of content would be bothersome to you, this is a very violent and pretty accurate depiction of the D-Day landing. I'm not going to require you to view it, so if you don't think it's a good idea for you to watch it for whatever reason, you don't have to. I don't want anyone to watch an extremely violent war depiction and get upset by it, so if you think this isn't something for you, feel free to go ahead and move on. Now, don't misunderstand me. Especially for those of you who've seen the movie, you know it's not the most disturbing and horrific thing in the world, but it is a pretty realistic depiction of war. So if that's not your thing, feel free to skip ahead. But in the meantime, assuming you went ahead and watched that, or you haven't watched it, we'll go ahead and look at the Eastern Front by 1945. Excuse me. The Eastern Front was, of course, located in Russia, where, as we talked about last time, Germany had been invading since 1941. One of the most infamous battles of the Eastern Front occurred in Stalingrad and lasted from about 1942 to 1943. This battle was significant because it saw the Russians finally halt the German offensive and turn the tide by November of 1943. This battle was so successful that they captured about 300,000 German troops by its conclusion. The Battle of Kursk also occurred during this time in July of 1943 and was the largest tank battle of the war and is also credited with helping to defeat the final German Eastern Offensive of the war. By January of 1945, the Russian troops had entered Germany. By April the 22nd of 1945, the Russian troops had invaded Berlin. And by April 30th, Hitler, Eva Braun, the Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels, and his wife had officially committed suicide. So if anybody tries to tell you that Hitler lived on in Argentina or something like that, there's very little historical evidence that would support that idea. He almost certainly did die. This, of course, led to the surrender of Nazi Germany by May 8th, which is known as VE Day, or Victory Europe Day. So again, the Russians did play a humongous role in ending the war, and were actually the ones who invaded Berlin and shut down Nazi Germany. Now, moving over into the Pacific Theater. As you might imagine, as we talked about last time, the Pearl Harbor attack was, of course, meant to limit America's involvement in the Pacific Theater. This initially led to some pretty great success for the Japanese. For example, by May of 1932, the Japanese controlled the Philippines. By later 1942, they controlled Malaya and Singapore. And by December of that year, they controlled Burma, the East Indies, New Guinea, and Java. However, the battle that is credited with turning the tide of the war are the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. In Coral Sea, this was a battle significant not only because it was a draw, but also because it was one of the instances I mentioned earlier where neither fleet physically saw each other. So again, having this new radar technology and this improved aircraft had improved warfare to such a degree that combatants no longer had to actually even physically see each other, really, in order to have combat. And the most, as you might also, one of the most important battles of the Pacific Theater is considered to be Midway, which was fought off the coast of Australia in June of 1942. This battle officially ended the Japanese invasion of Australia and is considered to be the stopping point, essentially, for Japanese imperialism and one of the last major invasions they were able to undergo in the Pacific. After this, essentially the war did turn against the Japanese. For example, between February and March of 1944, we were able to defeat the Japanese on the island of Iwo Jima, which of course has been memorialized in this famous photograph right here. Which, if you've heard people say that this photo was staged, that's half true, essentially. This did happen during the battle, at the conclusion of the battle, and the American flag was raised, but no one took a photograph of it, so they just redid the photo the next day, or redid the stage the next day. By October of 1944, America had recaptured the Philippines, and by June of 1945, we had captured Okinawa, which was considered to be a major turning point because this island is just barely off the coast of Japan. So again, one thing I hope that is brought across is that, given again the importance of the production output by women and other individuals in America during World War II. Because while the Soviet Union did carry a big brunt of the war in the European front, America was largely fighting on its own in the Pacific Theater. So a lot of this production output went to helping replace the losses of Pearl Harbor, allowing us to make up for our losses in the Japanese theater. Now, as you might be aware though, this manufacturing output is ultimately not what ended the war. What ultimately ended the war was the start of the nuclear age, which essentially is going to affect everything we talk about in the rest of these classes. Now, as you might imagine, both the American government and the military spent a lot of time trying to justify the use of such powerful nuclear weapons. A couple of things they brought up. First, they brought up the Japanese kamikaze tactics. As I'm sure many of you are aware, the Japanese did heavily practice kamikaze warfare. So therefore, even if you were able to seemingly defeat the Japanese, they could still sacrifice themselves trying to kill you. The Japanese also displayed a surprising unwillingness to surrender, and would often perform ritual and mass suicide as an attempt to avoid capture. Also, various American groups did try to estimate the casualties of attacking mainland Japan, and most of them seemed pretty bleak. It was estimated by most sources that between 1.7 or 4 million casualties would be suffered during the invasion of mainland Japan. As a result of this, Project Manhattan was underway from 1942 and was successfully completed and successfully tested on July 16th of 1945. This was the date of the first successful test. During this project, scientists were able to successfully complete nuclear fission, which is where you split an atom in order to create a chain destructive reaction. A couple of important things to note is that many of the immigrants and individuals working on this project were actually refugees who had fled Nazi Germany. For example, Albert Einstein, Klaus Fuchs, and Joseph Rotblat were some of the more prominent scientists involved in this project, and they had all fled portions of the world being attacked by Nazi Germany. Interestingly enough, this bomb was actually originally intended to be used on Nazi Germany. There's actually a very fantastic book I read recently called The Day of the Bomb, if you're interested in that sort of thing, that talks about how many of these scientists that I mentioned here and various other scientists did originally fled Nazi Germany, not only because they were being invaded, but because they realized that Germans were starting to do experiments into nuclear fission and nuclear weapons as well. So the original idea was to try to develop a nuclear bomb before the Nazis could. However, once we had VE Day and the Germans were defeated, we realized that we still had this weapon that we could use. American strategists looked at the consequences of attacking the mainland and decided they would use it on Japan instead. This, of course, led to the infamous bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was bombed at 8:15 a.m. on the morning of October the 6th, 1945. Colonel Paul Tibbets flew a B-52 bomber and did officially drop the first nuclear weapon ever used in world history. This is a uranium-based bomb and was called Little Boy. It exploded actually 2,000 feet in the air and was calculated that the point of destination was hotter than the surface of the sun. Between 70 to 80,000 people were killed as a result of the bombing immediately, and about 63% of all the buildings in the city were destroyed. The one survivor later gave an account of what the immediate aftermath of this bombing was like. They said, "There were so many injured people that there was almost no room to walk. This is only a mile from where the bomb fell. People's clothes had been blown off their bodies and burned by the heat rays. They looked as if they had strips of rags hanging from them. They had water blisters which had already burst, and their skin hung in tatters. Some had lost their eyes, some had their backs torn open so you can see their backbones inside. They were all asking for water." So again, I'm not going to give you, of course, a black and white depiction of whether these bombings were justified or not, but it is important to recognize the horrible human cost of the decision to drop this nuclear bomb. Helps to explain a bit why Americans were so concerned with attempting to justify and rationalize this decision. Of course, as you may guess, Japan did not immediately surrender, so on October 9th, Nagasaki was targeted as well. Major Charles Sweeney flew another B-52 bomber to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki. This is a plutonium-based bomb and was known as Fat Man. Interestingly, in a sort of ironic coincidence, this bomb was actually originally intended for Kokura and was spared due to cloud cover. This bomb was estimated to kill about 40,000 people, and especially unfortunately, because of this coincidence in sparing Kokura, this bomb's killings included about 1,000 Korean slaves who had been taken from Japanese conquest, and roughly 100 American prisoners of war who were being held in the city. So again, not only a big cost for the Japanese, it's also affecting others who were at the thrall of the Japanese as well. This, of course, did lead finally to the official end of the war. Between 2 to 4 months after the bombing, an estimated 90 to 146,000 people also died in Hiroshima from acute effects of the bombing, and roughly between 39,000 to 80,000 would later die in Nagasaki. August 9th, the Soviet Union also declared war on Japan, and between the 9th and the 13th of that month, destroyed most of the Japanese army that was still in China and occupied Manchuria. Finally, by the 15th, Japan surrendered, which has ever since been known as VJ Day or Victory Japan Day. Okay. Now that that's over with, I do want to, of course, talk about something I've neglected to look at thus far, which is the war on civilians and the huge costs on civilians during World War II. As many of you know, World War II was the most violent conflict in human history and had an enormous non-military death toll. Before the Holocaust, as we know it, Germany had already been historically attacking Jews for many times in gradually increasing ways. For example, that very early on after Hitler took over, they would start by boycotting and attacking Jewish businesses, such as the night known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass, when various Jewish shops across Berlin were attacked and had bricks thrown through their windows. Also, once the German army expanded into Poland, many ghettos and slave labor camps were set up. For example, this is a depiction of civilians being detained in the Warsaw ghetto in the capital of Poland. There were occasional uprisings in these ghettos, and as you can see here also, these were often very brutally put down. One of the more direct and violent examples of the war on civilians also occurred in the Soviet Union. As I mentioned earlier, Hitler considered Eastern Europeans and Russians in particular to essentially be subhuman, so mass killings of these individuals was extremely common. Many times, Soviet Union prisoners of war would be infamously lined up in these death squads, as you can see here, and just shot in the back. It has actually been said that it's difficult for even the Nazis to find soldiers to carry out these killings because they were so frequent and so brutal. The war on civilians became more formalized during the Wannsee Conference on January 10th, 1942. I believe I once again pronounced that wrong. Excuse me. This was the instance where Hitler and his top staff members officially came up with the final solution to the Jewish problem, which of course would formalize the Holocaust. In a nutshell, the final solution was that Jews and other undesirables who could work would be put into slave labor, such as those who were put in the ghettos, and the rest would just be killed. Major camps that spread up across Eastern Europe were, of course, the infamous Auschwitz camp, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmno, and Dachau. This was actually the first camp and one of the few that was in Germany. As you might imagine, the German High Command didn't put many of these concentration camps in Germany itself. They preferred to not make the German public see the harsh reality of what the Nazi regime was actually up to. So most of these camps, for example Auschwitz, were actually located in occupied Poland. To give you an idea of the toll of the Holocaust, it is actually difficult to go over the actual death toll of the Holocaust because, as you might imagine, the Nazis were very efficient in trying to hide evidence towards the end of the war especially. The documents were deliberately vague themselves. For example, it's not just coincidence that they only called this the final solution. They were never very specific in documents about exactly what they were going to do. Also, and for those of you who have read Elie Wiesel's Night, which is a very popular book I know in English programs, you might know about the death marches at the end of the war. Many of these camps had the prisoners taken out and marched across Europe in an effort to essentially get them away from the camps and kill them so the evidence would be gone. There were also repeated denials from the surviving leadership after the war was over. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, if I can pronounce that correctly, and Hitler's former essentially vice president Rudolf Hess repeatedly denied their knowledge of or participation in the Holocaust after the war was over. Now, I have given you a very detailed account of the estimated death count because I do think it's important to recognize that it was not just Jews who were targeted during the Holocaust. I, of course, do not want to diminish the suffering of the Jewish people, but it's important to understand just how many people were targeted as a result of the Holocaust policies. Of course, we all know that most of us know the famous death count for Jews. It was roughly 6 million. However, Soviet civilians did actually suffer potentially even more. While, of course, some of these Jews would fit into the Soviet category, about 7 million Soviet Union citizens were killed during the German invasion of the Soviet Union. About 3 million, specifically Soviet prisoners of war, were also killed. 1.8 million Polish civilians were killed. About 312,000 Serb civilians were killed. Disabled civilians living in various institutions were also killed. About 250,000. 250,000 gypsies were killed. About 1,900 Jehovah's Witnesses were killed. And also various repeat offenders and repeat criminals were killed. Roughly about 70,000. It is also homosexuals were specifically targeted as part of Nazi policies. This group in particular is a bit difficult to gauge because many of these individuals killed were likely just listed as being among the criminal category, because as you may guess, various homosexual acts were still considered to be illegal in various portions of Europe at this time. So it is estimated that anywhere between hundreds of homosexuals to thousands of homosexuals were also killed during the Holocaust. So again, a very wide variety of individuals were targeted by the Nazi command during this time. Now, while I in no way want to specifically or directly compare these two groups, I do think it's important to end this class on something that some of you may not be as aware of, which is the Japanese internment camps that America actually set up towards the end of World War II. On February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt passed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the military to relocate quote-unquote potential enemies into military zones across the western United States. This is officially intended to deter German and Italian Americans, but was only used for Japanese Americans. Now, why do you think this executive order just focused on the Japanese? Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. But yes, as you might imagine, this essentially is considered to be a good example of American potential hypocrisy and racism during World War II. On the one hand, we were fighting to liberate most of Europe from the racial policies of Nazi Germany, but on the other, we were ignoring potential enemies amongst the Germans and Italians and only focusing on the potential Japanese enemies in the area. The camp conditions, while they didn't compare to the concentration camps, of course, they were still quite brutal. The desert climate was extremely harsh, and the camps didn't have much protection for that. There would be frequent heat strokes during the daytime due, of course, to the heat, and the temperature sometimes got to 25 below zero at night. There was poor sanitation and food provided for the Japanese. They were often forced into hard labor, and the average time of confinement was about 900 days, or close to 3 years, essentially. It is also estimated that amongst all those interred, that there was about $400 million lost in property seizures. There were reparations given to the survivors and descendants of these camps. About $37 million was given out to internees in 1948. In 1988, about another $20,000 was distributed to each former internee. Now, one thing I'd like you to debate going into the future in this class is, was there any justification for this decision, and would we ever be justified in doing anything like this to another group? This is, I think, an especially relevant question considering today's political climate, so please do keep that in mind. But anyway, I know that was a big spiel, but that's all I have for you today. Just keep in mind your upcoming assignments once again, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.